Boker Or. Thanks so much, Mark. It's such a delight to be here with all of you. And thank you, each and every one of you, for showing up for your own practice, for each other, and for the healing that our opened hearts can bring to our world that needs it so much. So thank you for being here. It's really a pleasure and an honor. So there have been two questions that have come up in the teachings in this space recently that I want to continue to explore today as we end the book of Shmot and as we make our way into Purim. The first is, how do we hold the uncertainty and confusion of these times? How does our practice help us be with that? And the second is, in this time of Adar, our second month of Adar, what could it possibly mean to be in a state of simcha or joy this year, in this time in which world events continue to break our hearts and frighten us to our core? So we'll come back to this question of joy. But I want to begin by bringing us into the uncertain, into the unknown, and point us to the divine cloud, the divine presence that fills the Mishkan, the tabernacle, at the end of this week's Torah portion, Pekudei, which is actually at the very end of the book of Exodus. This book that tells the story of liberation, transition, confusion, uncertainty, and new ways of being and knowing. But before we get to the cloud, I want to just back up a little bit in our portion and note that this portion continues the rich, detailed description of the Mishkan and the clothes of Aaron, the high priest, who will serve in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. So at the beginning of our portion, everything is colorful and clear and precise. There are blues and gold and crimson and precious stones and careful measurements and clear instructions. It's all laid out and evokes a feeling for me of, we've got this. Inviting God into our lives might take a lot of work, but the path of spiritual service or practice is at least clear. And then we come to the very end of the whole book of Exodus. The Israelites, or we through them, have had the courage to come out of Egypt, to cross the sea, to be with our anxiety about where our food and water would come from in the desert, the overwhelm of Sinai, and finally, it seems that everything will be clear and stable. The Mishkan is so clear and stable. And then suddenly, it just isn't. We read in the end of our book, and Jordan, if you can pull this up, please, for a moment. That when Moses had finished the work, the presence of God filled the tabernacle, and Moses couldn't enter. And there's the screen share. Thanks, I wasn't seeing it. Moses couldn't enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh filled the tabernacle. Thanks, Jordan. We can go back to seeing each other for now. In this moment, it seems to me that God is not in the cloud as we might think from a similar scene at Sinai, but rather God is the cloud, which blurs the sharp details of the earlier crisp description of the Mishkan. It seems to say to Moses, you thought you had finally figured it out? Think again. In the language of our Purim story, nahaftochu, let it turn and become something new again. In the presence of the divine fog, the practice instruction to Moses and in turn to us is simply to sit and to witness, to be with the uncertainty until at some point it lifts. And when the cloud or the fog lifts, we don't actually return to the comfortable clarity of how things were, but rather we are guided to set out, to be with what is emerging anew, perhaps from within the cloud, perhaps from within us. And we can do this because in the soft mist of the cloud, we can see what was there. I imagine that we can see through the cloud the details of the Mishkan, but they're blurred. And that blurred appearance challenges what we thought we knew, what seems so clear, softens our grip on our perceptions and our assumptions, and opens us to something new. These days, the divine cloud that brings us into uncertainty seems to me to be a very familiar face of the divine. But what about the guidance that the cloud provides? Where do we get our direction in these uncertain times? We might think of our meditation as an insight practice. We sit in the uncertainty, resting in the vapor, the cloud of our breath and the sensations of our body, and wait until something new arises or unfolds that we might not have accessed through a more linear, direct, active, or clear path. And this has certainly been true for me, that insights will just naturally arise in practice when I pay attention to my direct experience and just wait. But as we approach Purim, I want to offer an alternative path and suggest that simcha, joy or pleasure, may be another source of internal guidance. Mark was talking about the creativity series that IJS will be doing, and I facilitate a mindful art practice called the Jewish Studio Process. And the first instruction in the act of creativity in this practice, creating something new in the place of the unknown, is simply to follow pleasure. Instead of bringing onto the page the idea or the image that is already clear in our minds, we simply put brush to paper and let pleasure, what feels good and right and whole, what has energy, direct us. Especially this year, pleasure may feel slightly different than the lighthearted, boisterous joy that we usually associate with Purim. But I want to invite you to consider what this quality of a directly experienced small moment of goodness might be for you. Maybe a single delicious in-breath or the hug of a loved one. The Zohar tells the following story of the Israelites as they left Egypt. And Jordan, if you can pull up the second text, please. Come and see. When Israel went out from Egypt, their spirit was broken within, as ours are. They heard the praises of the angels singing, but they could not rejoice. When a person leaves their labor, they realize the brokenness of their bones, the brokenness of their spirit. And so when Israel went out, it was then that they tasted the taste of death. and the Blessed Holy One healed them. As it's written, Yud-He-Vav-He was going before them by day. And this pasuk, this verse, is an earlier reference in the book of Shemot, of Exodus, to our cloud that we've been talking about in the Mishkan. So through this cloud, every way emitted a healing fragrance, which entered them, and they were healed. Hearing the sounds of praises, they rejoiced and their spirits calmed. Thanks, Jordan. We can go back to seeing each other. So what was it that brought a bit of healing to the people in their brokenness and devastation? Simply inhaling a delicious, pleasurable fragrance. This delight is precisely what softens and soothes the people, if only for the moment, who perhaps are still in a state of kotzer ruach, constriction, unable to hear the angels singing or to really take in that sound. This expanded state opens them to the possibility of something new, sparking their capacity to imagine beyond the arid desert in front of them and the trauma, pain, and grief within them, not pushing it aside or discounting the pain, but simply expanding their field of perception to include, for the moment, an experience that may evoke joy or calm or ease. So I want to invite us to investigate all of this in our own experience, our own practice. So if it's comfortable for you, invite your eyes to close or your gaze to soften. Rest your awareness in that which is concrete and stable and clear. Perhaps your feet on the ground, the chair supporting you. Feel that stability. And allow and invite some expansion and softening in your body. Inviting your shoulders to soften, your jaw to soften, your eyes to rest. And noticing wherever it's most available to you, the breath, this intangible but palpable divine presence that fills you as it filled the Mishkan, and then letting it go in its own time. Inviting in each breath and letting it go. And if you notice thoughts coming in, just let them soften and leave. Coming back to the breath. You may stay with the directly felt experience of the breath, or if you are feeling a sense of spaciousness and stability in your awareness, you might open to whatever is most apparent in your direct sensation. Just being with whatever is most present in the field of awareness without having to know what it means or is, without story, just being with presence. Perhaps becoming aware of the dynamic nature of the object of your awareness. Whether it's a tight shoulder or the breath or the buzzing of a knee, as you sit and witness, as you are with this sensation, just notice, is there any movement? How solid or not is it? Just being with that. And for the last 4 minutes or so of our sit, notice if there is a direct sensation in your body that feels pleasurable. It may be the breath, the feeling of the rise and fall of the chest. It may be a buzzing in the knee or the shoulder. Allow your attention to rest in a directly felt sensation of pleasure. And in this last minute or two of our sit, you may want to play with following any impulse for movement that would feel good in your body. Maybe very small, very slow. But is there some way that your body wants to move? Not thinking about it or planning, but just following pleasure in movement. The wiggle of a toe or the movement of a hand or shoulder. And coming back to stillness. And when you're ready, open your eyes. Perhaps connecting with the face, the radiant face of one person in our virtual space.
Thank you so much, Margie. What a beautiful way to ease us into Shabbat. And friends, inviting you to stay with us for a minute as we make space and time for those who are mourning to recite the Mourner's Kaddish. If you're observing your art site or if it's your custom to join, and you can put the name or names of those who are honoring in the chat now or after we recite Kaddish. And if you're not reciting Kaddish, as always, your presence, your compassionate presence for those who are is much appreciated. And invite those who are reciting it to join me by rising in body or in spirit, and you can unmute at this time. Yitgadal, B'dash, Shane Rabbi, Yama, Dibra, Kirite, Yamit, Malkute, Chayekol, Yemekol, Ufiye, Defolte, Kisrael, Agala, Yisman Kari, V'Yimru, Amen, Yehesh, Me, Rabba, Yitbarach, Yishach, Yishar, La'ela min kol birakotah v'shukotah v'shbachatah v'netanatah ba'amiram ba'aman Yehi shlama rabba mishmaya b'chaim aleinu v'yachayim amen Teh shalom b'ramav aleinu Amen. Amen. Friends, thanks so much for joining us today. I want to thank our teacher, Rabbi Margie Jacobs, for leading us so beautifully. If you're leaving us now, I want to put in the lineup for our teachers for next week. Will be led by Rabbi Dan Lieben when we resume our practice on Monday, and Kat Karn will be joining us from Israel on Tuesday and Wednesday, offering a 2-day mini-series. Rabbi Adam Klickfeld will be leading us Thursday from LA, and on Friday, next week from today. Very happy that Yael Shai will lead us in practice to sit into Shabbat. And thanks so much, as always, to Jordan Pollack for holding our space beautifully today, and for those who sponsored today's practice, Diane and Susan Rubenstein, in loving memory of their dad, Professor Gilbert M. Rubenstein. Zichrono livracha, may his memory be a blessing. As always, you're invited to stay on for conversation with our teacher today, Rabbi Margie Jacobs, about today's teaching and practice. We're just to use this time to sit together and be leaving us now. I want to wish you a Shabbat Shalom. We'll hope to see you back on Monday. So let's invite Margie in here. If you have a question, please write question in all caps. Keep an eye on questions in the chat. Margie, thank you so much for rich and really soothing. I mean, I think it really was, really did ease us into Shabbat. And there were so many beautiful foundations for the practice today. The healing aspect, the marking the journey and where we are, and marking this juncture of the completion of the Mishkan, and the healing following the liberation from Egypt, and then the sustenance. But the question I want to start with actually has to do with that sense of guidance, which is so powerful. The cloud and the fire that guide the people and guide everyone's journeys. I just felt that was a very palpable thing. I loved how you invited us to sit in the vapor of our own cloud, individually and collectively. So I want to invite you to see if you want to say a little bit more about in meditation, and except at the end when you invited us to move, we're sedentary, we're sitting, and yet there's a sense about an inkling about direction that's present, and you captured that also in describing this interplay between knowing and not knowing, clarity and lack of clarity. And I thought you really captured that so beautifully. And in the interplay between knowing and not knowing, there is something, some, I don't know, I'm just using the word inkling right now. I don't know what you would say. It's just, often use the word discernment, but this is like this intuitive sense about what's the next step. Where do we take our next step? So I wanted about you to, about if as if we're sitting here with that message from Torah this week of being guided by divine presence. How does that play into just sitting still?
So, in a way, our meditation practice is the training for being able to listen, as you're saying, to that place between the known and the emerging in the rest of our lives.
Mhm.
And so we begin with just focusing on one thing, on our breath, on something that is very rhythmic and actually is the meeting point between the voluntary and the involuntary, right? But even with that, we're doing it in the place that it is most apparent. So part of the guidance comes in our sit in what is drawing our attention.
Mhm.
What are we noticing? So even when we start with our breath, is it in the rise and fall of my chest or the in and out of air through my nostrils? And being able to pay attention to what is calling to me in this very subtle, embodied, present way is so different from what we, or I'll say I, typically do, which is very much like reaching outside of myself and looking around and what is that I need to pay attention to and what is it that I want to pay attention to, and it's just coming from a very much noisier, headier,
Mhm.
less embodied place. And so the more that we can tune into what is actually rising to meet my steady awareness that is just waiting and is just receiving, then I may be able to do that a little bit more when I'm, not in my practice.
Yeah.
But the
I think,
piece, yeah,
go
sorry.
ahead. No, go ahead.
But I think the piece that's added for me from creative practice, from creative process,
Mhm.
it's not just this neutral calling of awareness, but it's actually sometimes what feels good, what is pleasurable,
Mhm.
what is delicious. And one thing that I learned long ago at Spirit Rock was that when we are in a practice that is calling forth our pleasure, it's actually easier to sustain our attention because that's juicy and that's
Mhm.
pleasurable, like the fragrance that keeps us going in the desert.
Mhm. How would you relate that to instructions that often are given in meditation practice, to note, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, just basically categorize that, but not to get carried away with it, right? Not to say, oh, pleasant, 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 and move into, a more grasping
Yes.
mind versus, or aversion.
Yeah. I'm
So how
so
does that play in? How does one notice and take in pleasure without
yeah.
getting intoxicated?
I'm so glad that you asked
That's
that.
a good Purim question.
At our IJS Chabraya retreat last month, Rabbi Nancy Flam, who created all of this, was talking about exactly that, just staying neutral,
Mhm.
not getting hooked by that which seems pleasant or unpleasant. And right after that, I was going to lead our group in creative process and tell them and invite them to follow pleasure. And so I said exactly the same thing. I asked Nancy, like, how do I hold these two things? And her answer, which was helpful to me, was that the pleasant and unpleasant that we are trying to get a little bit of space from in our practice is a reaction to what is external. And it's taking us outside of ourselves. It's kind of planning, looking into the future. It is coming, the grasping is actually coming from a place of lack, right? I want this thing. I don't have this thing. I have it right now, but I'm worried that it's going to go away. All of that. This pleasure is actually being very present, and it's listening to the internal, still small voice. In that place of pleasure, we don't know where we're going, and we're not really concerned about that. And we are just in and really receiving the experience rather than the grasping or the wanting that we're trying to soften in our practice.
It's a great distinction. And, mentioning Nancy Flam and her teaching, I grabbed quickly a poem that she referenced in this regard this year. She also, I think, realized that she had done the same a year ago. And it's a good one. Very short poem by William Blake about joy, which really captures this: one who binds oneself to joy, a joy does the winged life destroy. One who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. So a really nice way to, make that distinction between connecting with pleasure and joy, but not being carried away with it.
And not
good.
holding it tightly, like really
Mhm,
having an open
mhm,
hand, right?
mhm,
Or the open hand, just the gentleness and the softness and
mm,
the allowing for it to move us, right?
yeah, yeah. Maybe one more. I'm looking. Nope. Yeah, but we're all the good questions. You're showing us such many. We have great questions. I think people are very blissed out by that sit today. Um, I was going to ask a question about the healing process, about the sequence, because tell me if I got this wrong, but it felt as though in connecting the dots that the healing was kind of a prerequisite or a lead-in to what we were just talking about pleasure and joy. That is, that having tasted death in Egypt required some healing process before one could feel joy. Like I'm thinking about Psalm 30 and just about the process of grieving, mourning, dealing with loss, trauma, pain, ultimately yields joy, but we can't hurry joy. Can't, there's no that would be a spiritual bypass.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this following pleasure is one of many tools in our toolkit. And really it's one more way to be with, right? So if what is most present in our awareness is pain and grief and how that is showing up in our bodies, then the wise thing is to be with that. But I think for me, that planting the seed of where is the pleasure can also open me to notice what I might not notice in those moments of pain and grief that tend to narrow my field of perception. And so the people were in this place of trauma and pain, and what guided them, and it didn't, it's misty. It's not going to completely obfuscate the pain and the grief, just like it doesn't completely cover up the details of the Mishkan. It's just a layer. And in that moment, the fragrance comes in and they smell it. And maybe, right? Not forcing, not pushing aside anything, just maybe there's a little bit of softening and opening from that temporary moment of pleasure.
That's a good, and also I guess it's a little foretaste, as it were, of the spices of Havdalah, also about bringing us into the week. So thanks for that, Margie.
There's
All right, why don't we leave it at this. Again, thanks to you, Susan and Diane, for sponsoring today. Thanks, Margie, for leading us beautifully, and to Jordan. Just to note, everybody, there's a new episode of Jewish Meditation for Everyone, which is our podcast version of the Daily Sit, which this week features a beautiful teaching by and practice Rabbi Joshua Bodiger from this past Tuesday. So you may want to, oh, Jordan, you were on it. So thank you so much. Please do check it out. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and please spread the word about it as well. We'll look forward to seeing everyone back here on Monday for practice with Rabbi Dan Lieben. Margie?
And can I just,
Sure.
in terms of how people can get in touch with me, it's rabbimargie.com. And the page about art practice is /art practice, in addition to checking out Jewish Studio Project. And I will be in May leading a Jewish Studio process that brings in Zohar and Chassidut and images of the divine for ritual well. So be looking out for that. And in April, for those who happen to be in the Bay Area, I'll be leading the process for parents of teenagers. So, and I also work one-on-one in spiritual coaching, bringing in creativity and mindfulness. And so on.
Thanks. We got the website right, rabbimargie.com. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Wishing everybody a sweet restorative Shabbat, and look forward to seeing you back here on Monday, everyone.
Nice
Be
to
well.
be with all of you. Thanks so much, Mark. Shabbat shalom.
Pleasure. Shabbat shalom.